WashingTECH.
Tropes that often underlie misinformation are fairly predictable, meaning we don't exactly know what kind of misinformation is going to go viral in the future, but we have a reasonable idea of how people are going to go about mounting a misinformation campaign.
Are you worried about your kids' safety on the internet? We are here to help. WashingTECH's 5-step checklist will take you through the process of protecting your kids, and will give you tips on how to set up the best parental controls for your children on their devices. You want what's best for your children. They deserve to be safe online. Our step-by-step guide will help you make sure they are. Download WashingTECH's online safety checklist today to protect your kids online. Find it at protectyourkids.online. That's protectyourkids.online.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of WashingTECH.
WashingTECH, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Jon Roozenbeek, a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on building resilience against misinformation and extremism. He's currently writing 2 books with Cambridge University Press, The Psychology of Misinformation and Influence, Information, and War in Ukraine. Super important topic today. Jon Roozenbeek. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be here.
So tell us about your background and what led you to this work, Jon.
This work started, well, in conception, I suppose, when I was working on my PhD, and my PhD was about media discourse in Ukraine, especially in Donbass, eastern Ukraine, the part where the war is going on right now. And while I was working on that, I became very interested in the problem of misinformation or disinformation or whatever you might want to call it, and especially how to tackle it in some way. And I was working on a project together with a friend of mine from Holland to see if we could build a game that would help people spot misinformation. And that is what eventually became Bad News, which is an online game that people can play where they, play the role of the bad guy, I suppose, meaning they run a fake news website. And in doing so, they learn about various sort of manipulation tactics and strategies that are often used in misinformation. And I started at the time working with the psychology department, my colleague Sander van der Linden, here in Cambridge, to see if playing this game actually measurably improves your ability to detect when you're being manipulated. So that was sort of the start of that research, that line of research, I guess. And then in 2020, we got in touch with Jigsaw, which is a research arm of Google. And they said, well, games are really nice, that's fun and all that, but they're not very scalable, right? Because however good your game is, most people will never play it. And what they thought, which was a very good idea, was, well, actually, what about we apply this approach, which is preemptively trying to improve people's ability to spot manipulative tactics and tropes and so on that are often used in misinformation. But let's change the medium, meaning let's change it from games to videos, because videos are very scalable. You can run them as ads on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or even television if you want to. And they don't rely so much on someone deciding to play a game for 10 to 15 minutes.
We had Sander on the show way back in 2017. I don't know if you heard that episode, but, it's interesting that we're still, trying to do this thing where, and I guess this was just when Trump was elected. It was in March, just a couple months after he was inaugurated, I guess. So it's just interesting how, these things are progressing, and I'm so glad, there are, more folks working on this important issue. What are some specific societal harms that you've seen caused by mis and disinformation, and what are the differences between misinformation, disinformation, and fake news for those who aren't aware?
So what are the societal harms? So there's a lot of research, for instance, that links misinformation susceptibility to vaccine uptake. And so one of the studies that we've recently done, which is currently under review, is we linked, we measured how likely someone is on average to fall for any random example of misinformation using a particular scale. And we correlated that with vaccine uptake in the United Kingdom by postcode. And what we found was that the more likely someone was to believe misinformation in a given postcode, the lower the vaccine uptake in that postcode, right? Which is fascinating as far as sort of societal level consequences, belief or susceptibility to misinformation go. And then there's other examples, obviously, around COVID, right? We had a lot of people who falsely believed that drinking alcohol would cure coronavirus. And so a lot of people died from alcohol poisoning in Iran. In Brazil, the president, Bolsonaro, has expressed, let's say, less than reliable statements about the virus, its origins, how to cure it, so on, which directly informs, obviously, how the Brazilian government tackles misinformation. So there's a lot of consequences to this. Another one would, for example, be, although we don't know that for sure, empirically speaking, misinformation possibly influencing election results, right? We're currently designing an experiment to see if that's actually the case. Societal trust in one another. You might get like an exaggerated or far too negative view of people on the other side of the aisle, right? Polarization, for instance. So these are some of the consequences that I think most people would consider harmful. As far as the distinction between misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and so on, I wish there was an objective answer to this, but honestly, scientists don't agree. So, yeah, well, here we are. No, so what people will often say is that fake news refers to news that you can fact check and rate as false, right? But that doesn't encompass, I guess, the entire breadth of the problem, because a lot of content isn't really provably false, but certainly counts as misinformation, or at least a reasonable person might consider it as such. For instance, there was a headline just somewhere early 2021, March or April, I believe, which read, I've memorized because I thought it was interesting. This healthy doctor died 2 weeks after receiving the COVID vaccine. The CDC is investigating why, right? Okay, so every single word in that headline is true. That did happen. The doctor did die. However, right, the implication that he died because he got the vaccine, that's false, or at least there's no evidence. So here you have a bit of a problem, right? Nobody lied. And in fact, the editor might say, well, look, I didn't lie. I got a lot of clicks because this was one of the most shared articles on Facebook of 2021. I did my job, no problem. However, you might say, well, you're implying that someone died because they got vaccinated, which has tremendous downstream consequences potentially, which didn't happen, right? So I myself tend to not focus too much on veracity when I talk about misinformation, but rather epistemic quality, I guess, by which I mean lying is one form of manipulation, right? But there's other things you can do too. You can leave out relevant context. You can use a logical fallacy. You can manipulate people's emotions. You can try to fuel polarization and so on. So a better definition, in my view, of misinformation would be a definition that also focuses on how misleading something is or how manipulative it might be. And then finally, disinformation tends to refer to, I guess, deliberate campaigns by governments or companies, let's say, that are aimed at manipulating people or swaying public opinion or sowing confusion about a particular issue. For example, tobacco companies have mounted a decades-long disinformation campaign against sort of, increased legislation against smoking and curbing tobacco consumption and so on. And then obviously a very famous one is the Russian government's disinformation campaign surrounding the US elections, which not singling that one out necessarily, but that did happen, right? But other countries also engage in this kind of work. It's not just Russia, although it's definitely Russia.
Yeah, not to mention the use of Drano for as a COVID vaccine. Wow. So you and your authors, Sander van der Linden, who we talked about earlier, as well as Beth Goldberg, Steve Rathje, and Stefan Lewandowski wrote a prominent research article recently in Science's Advances on how to inoculate the public against misinformation and disinformation. What's your general thesis on this topic of how to actually inoculate folks against everything you just described?
So the idea for this sort of sprang forth from a discussion about the limitations of debunking or correcting misinformation, which is to say, I do think we should be debunking misinformation. I think that's very important, but it has certain limitations. For instance, I can lie much faster than an entire room full of people can fact check me, right? So there's a scaling problem here, an asymmetry in terms of how fast you can fact check compared to how fast misinformation spreads. There's also the problem of engagement with fact checks, right? A lot of people who consume a lot of misinformation on social media, they don't interact in any helpful manner with fact checks, for example, because of distrust. And then there's the continued influence effect, which is a finding from psychology, which basically indicates that people don't forget all about the misinformation that they once believed after it's corrected. There's some residual effects in your memory, right? Which means, again, doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it does mean that other approaches are also required. So the approach that we've applied is preemptive, meaning preventing people from falling for misinformation, or at least reducing the likelihood in some capacity. And what we wanted to avoid was entering this morass or this swamp of discussions about what is and what isn't a fact, right? Because that is incredibly politicized from time to time, right? Choosing which facts you care about, for instance, is highly politicized. And so what we thought was, yeah, that's all well and good, but the tropes that often underlie misinformation are fairly predictable, meaning we don't exactly know what kind of misinformation is going to go viral in the future, but we have a reasonable idea of how people are going to go about mounting a misinformation campaign or spreading false narratives. And so we created a series of very short videos, about 1.5 minutes long, animated videos. And each of these videos trains you to spot a particular manipulation technique that is often used in misinformation. For example, emotional manipulation, right? Outrage and fear and anger and these kinds of things, or whipping up those types of sentiments to divert your attention away from the accuracy of a particular story. False dichotomies, right? If you're not with me, you're against me, that type of deal. Incoherence, meaning mutually exclusive arguments. So, for instance, in the climate, well, I was going to call it a debate, but it isn't exactly that. Climate debate, just to remain polite, I suppose. You'll have people say, well, it's not global warming, it's global cooling that's happening, right? And at the same time, these same people will make the argument that climate models are bad and we can't predict what's going to happen with the climate. Meaning, you can't use both of these arguments at the same time. They rule each other out, logically speaking. So that's an example of incoherence. The next video was about ad hominem attacks, so attacking the person, but not the argument, which it's a subtle point, because if a tobacco company says, don't worry, vaping is 100% safe, we've tested it, you're like, wow, considering your track record, I'm not sure if I believe you, which is reasonable, right, in this particular case, but in other cases it really isn't, and ad hominem is actually a logical fallacy. And then the final one was scapegoating, which is holding an individual or a group solely responsible for a very complex problem. So these are the manipulation techniques that we tackle because we know they're common, right? We don't make any claims as to how common they are, but common enough. And we basically wanted to see, okay, if you watch one of these videos, do you actually become meaningfully better at recognizing this particular manipulation technique on social media?
Policy is global policy. This is the WashingTECH Tech Policy Podcast, serving the world.
And when it comes to hate speech, would the same analysis or approach apply when we're talking about attacking groups of people? Same thing you just described for deciding for when people attribute a particular problem to a single individual?
Yeah, exactly. So that's also part of the reason why we stayed away from making claims about what is and what isn't truth, right? Because when it comes to scapegoating, for instance, well, let me use an example from the refugee crisis in Europe, right? After the war in Ukraine escalated in February. So what you see, and what was completely predictable ahead of time, is there were millions of people who fled from Ukraine to Europe, countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. Because there's millions of people, statistically speaking, one of them is going to commit a crime, right? That's just how stats work. So what you see, which is very obvious, is people who want to sow disinformation, distrust, increase negative opinions and negative perceptions of Ukrainian refugees. What they do is they take this one example, which is true, let's say, right? And they amplify it. And they say, look, this is how Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees are repaying us for our hospitality, right? This is what they choose to do with the fact that we've chosen to give them shelter in this difficult time, blah, 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 blah. And so you go on from that, right? Basically trying to make people feel more negatively about the Ukrainian refugees as a group by using a single example that is in no way representative of the broader group. So that's an example of scapegoating. And that's the idea behind this project, was partially to make clear how these tactics work and how they might be used against you.
So how does your approach upgrade, differ from, or build upon previous research on inoculation against misinformation and disinformation?
So this idea of inoculating people against misinformation and disinformation is old enough. It's from the 1960s originally. So the origin story, which is quite hilarious if you ask me, is in the 1960s. A psychologist at Yale named William McGuire was asked by the US government, hey, can you help us prevent US soldiers from being brainwashed by the Viet Cong? Which, again, if you think about that now, you're like, well, that's a pretty silly idea. But at the time, you had very different ideas about how the human mind works, right? So William McGuire obviously quickly found out that is an unreasonable proposition. But it did give him the idea of what later became inoculation theory, which is to say inducing preemptive resistance against misinformation rather than correcting it post hoc. And McGuire himself did a lot of experiments on this in the 60s and 70s, and then other people picked it up. But it's only in 2016, 17, 18 maybe that it started being applied to the modern context of misinformation. And so, for example, John Cook, who is a great researcher currently at Monash University in Melbourne, he, and then also Sander van der Linden, my colleague, and myself, we thought, well, why not apply this framework to manipulation techniques, tropes, and strategies rather than individual examples of misinformation, right? And initially, what happened was you show people a piece of text, the infographic, let's say, where you explain how a particular fallacy works, right? And then you hope that produces vulnerability or susceptibility to that particular fallacy. Then came the games. And that's, for example, bad news. But John Cook also created Cranky Uncle, which is about climate misinformation. And then we also did Harmony Square, which is about political disinformation again. And then Go Viral, which is about COVID misinformation. And there's a few more of these games that we're sort of currently creating. And again, so they work quite well, experimentally speaking, but they are limited in their scale and their scalability. So that's why we decided to work with videos. And I think the big contribution that we made in this particular study was, it's not just that we showed that they're effective in the lab, which, again, lab studies by this point, when it comes to misinformation, are dime a dozen. Some really good, some not so great. But there's a lot of lab studies about this particular problem, testing interventions and so on. But what we did was, we're not the first, but one of the first to run a field study, meaning you test the intervention not in a lab setting or an online setting, but in an actual setting in which people regularly consume misinformation. And our setting was YouTube. And to my knowledge, we're the first to test inoculation interventions on YouTube, or more broadly speaking, in a naturalistic setting on social media. And we found that watching one of these videos as a YouTube ad, which is what we did. So normally you would watch an ad about, I don't know, some company, whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. And then about 1 million people on YouTube a while ago saw some of our videos as YouTube ads. What we found was that people who watched this ad were significantly, meaningfully better than the control group at correctly identifying these manipulation techniques and headlines that we showed them within the YouTube environment using the YouTube brand lift survey tool, it's called. So we were able to show that even in an ecologically valid, naturalistic setting, these findings that we originally obtained in lab studies hold up really well, even in an environment where people have tons and tons of distractions, where they can choose not to watch the ad at all, to turn off the sound or skip the ad or install ad block or whatever. And the fact that the effects remain significant even there, I think, is very meaningful.
So where do we go from here, Jon? What's going to be the output of this, and how are you going to? Is this something that you're going to deploy on a larger scale?
So we've created a website where people can watch and download the videos, www.inoculation.science, which contains more information about the project and so on, in case people are interested. And for us, there's a few steps that we're undertaking. Number one, we're creating a couple more videos, hopefully. So Google itself, for instance, is currently about to roll out, I'm not exactly sure about the timeline, a very similar project using pre-bunking or inoculation videos in Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia to counter mis and disinformation about refugees within the context of the war in Ukraine. That's number one. Another project is we're trying to create more of these videos, but also what we're hoping to do is build a translation pipeline, because right now the videos only exist in English, but they're not just useful in English, of course. So there's a bit of a challenge there because of the different cadence and the different sort of tempo and manner of speaking that different languages have that don't make the videos instantly translatable. But nonetheless, that is one of the next steps.
So it sounds like a fantastic project, quite an undertaking, and with any luck, we'll end up with a more just society because of it, worldwide society because of it. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us, Jon, before we close, and where can we find you online?
I think what the study shows quite convincingly, if I do say so myself, is it is possible to increase resilience against misinformation and manipulation at scale. And I think it is very useful if we apply this knowledge directly, for example, on social media platforms as part of PSAs or other campaigns that we're using to sort of tackle vulnerability to misinformation. However, I think it's also important to note that I don't think that this is the end-all, be-all solution to this problem. By which I mean, I think psychological solutions, this is one of them, psychological inoculation. They're useful, they can be shown to work, assuming they're designed well, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to tackle the problem from other directions as well. For example, if it turns out to be the case that algorithms direct people, generally speaking, towards malicious content, it's worth looking at those algorithms and not only inoculate people against that manipulative content and then be done with it. I don't think that's enough, personally speaking. Where can people find me online? I'll be terribly honest. I have a Twitter account. It's Roozenbot, Roozenbot. But I don't use it that much. It's taken a lot of time away from stuff that I like a lot better, but people can find me there if they want.
Super, super interesting research, Jon. And, the interesting thing is that this is misinformation, disinformation, and quote unquote fake news been going going on all the way, probably for all of human history. We only started looking at it, in the 60s, like you mentioned. So it'd be interesting to see what other interventions we can come up with. Jon Roozenbeek is postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge. Jon, thanks for joining me.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
WashingTECH.